When the headline first broke, most people assumed it was a joke. Florida, a state already famous for alligators in swimming pools, giant lizards on golf courses, and pythons long enough to swallow a deer whole, had apparently decided that the answer to its snake problem was more snakes. Social media exploded with mockery. Comment sections filled with jokes about horror movies, memes about Florida man logic, and predictions that this would somehow end with snakes the size of school buses slithering through suburban backyards. But behind the punchlines was a story that almost nobody bothered to actually read. A story rooted in more than a decade of science, heartbreak, near extinction, and one of the most quietly remarkable comeback stories in American conservation history. The truth about what Florida is really doing and why is far stranger and far more fascinating than the jokes ever gave it credit for. To understand why Florida would ever consider releasing more snakes into the wild, you first have to understand just how badly things had already gone wrong. The story begins, as so many Florida disasters do, with the exotic pet trade. Burmese pythons, native to the swamps and grasslands of Southeast Asia, became a fashionable exotic pet in the United States sometime in the 1970s. They were sold in strip mall pet shops and roadside stands as adorable, foot-long hatchlings, marketed to buyers who had no idea what they were actually bringing home. The problem is that a Burmese python does not stay small. Within a few years, that cute little snake curled up in a 10-gallon tank grows into a 13-foot-long apex predator capable of consuming prey larger than a grown man. Faced with an animal they could no longer feed, house, or control, many owners did the unthinkable. They drove out to the edge of the Everglades and let their pythons go, assuming the swamp would simply swallow the problem the way it seemed to swallow everything else in South Florida. It did not. What the Everglades gave the pythons instead was paradise. Warm, wet, teeming with prey, and almost entirely free of natural predators capable of challenging a fully grown constrictor, South Florida became the perfect breeding ground. The pythons thrived in ways that shocked even the scientists who study invasive species for a living. A single female can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a clutch. They have no real predators once they reach adulthood, aside from the occasional alligator willing to risk the fight. And because pythons are, by nature, secretive, patient ambush hunters that can remain motionless for hours while blending perfectly into marsh grass and shadow, they proved almost impossible to find, let alone stop. The scale of the destruction became clear through one particularly grim scientific study. Researchers with the United States Geological Survey, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and the University of Florida released 95 marsh rabbits, each fitted with a tracking collar, into areas of the Everglades known to be infested with pythons. Within 11 months, more than 3/4 of those rabbits were dead, and pythons were responsible for the overwhelming majority of those deaths. It was not an isolated result. Surveys across the region found similarly catastrophic declines in raccoons, opossums, bobcats, and other mid-sized mammals that had once been common sights along Everglades roadways. Wading birds, deer, and even young alligators were turning up in the stomachs of dissected pythons. One particularly infamous necropsy revealed a snake that had swallowed an entire white-tailed deer. Biologists were no longer just describing a nuisance species. They were describing an ecological collapse happening in slow motion, chewing through the food web from the bottom up. Florida did not sit idle while this unfolded. Wildlife officials tried everything conventional wisdom could suggest. They launched the Florida Python Challenge, an annual public hunting competition that draws hundreds of participants from across the country, each hoping to win a share of a prize pool for catching the most or the longest snake. In one recent year alone, more than 900 participants combed the swamps and managed to remove fewer than 300 pythons combined, a number that sounds impressive until you consider that a single female python and her descendants could theoretically produce thousands of offspring within just a few breeding seasons. The state also created the Python Elimination Program, hiring contracted removal agents and paying them by the hour plus a bonus scale to the length of every snake they bring in, with extra incentives for the biggest catches of the month. Conservation groups like the Conservancy of Southwest Florida took an even more scientific approach, surgically implanting radio transmitters into male pythons and releasing them back into the wild as so-called scout snakes. Because male pythons instinctively seek out breeding females during mating season, biologists could track the scouts using telemetry equipment and follow them straight to the reproductive females hiding in the brush, snakes that would otherwise be virtually impossible to locate. That program alone has been credited with removing more than 20 tons of invasive python biomass from a 200-square-mile stretch of southwest Florida since 2013, and it has prevented an estimated 20,000 python eggs from ever hatching. And yet, despite years of hunting contests, bounty programs, drone surveillance, detection dogs, and radio tag scout snakes, the python population in the Everglades has continued to expand its range, creeping north and west year after year. Wildlife managers openly admit that total eradication is, at this point, almost certainly impossible. The python is simply too well hidden, too well adapted, and too prolific for humans to hunt their way out of the problem entirely. That sobering reality forced biologists to ask a very different kind of question. If people cannot outhunt the pythons, could nature do a better job than humans ever could? The answer scientists landed on was not some genetically engineered superpredator or an imported species from another continent, both of which carry the risk of creating an entirely new invasive disaster. Instead, the answer was something Florida already had, something that used to roam its pine forest by the thousands before humans very nearly wiped it off the map entirely. The answer was the eastern indigo snake. If you have never heard of the eastern indigo snake, you are not alone. And that is exactly the tragedy at the heart of this story. The eastern indigo is the longest native snake species in North America, capable of reaching 7, sometimes 8 feet in length, with a body of deep, iridescent blue-black scales that shimmer almost purple in direct sunlight. Unlike a python, the indigo does not constrict its prey. It simply overpowers whatever it catches with a powerful, crushing bite and swallows it alive, a hunting style that has earned it a reputation among biologists as one of the most fearless predators in the entire southeastern ecosystem. Its scientific genus name, Drymarkin, translates roughly to forest ruler, a name earned honestly. Historically, eastern indigo snakes ranged across the pine forests of Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi in numbers so healthy that early naturalists described encountering them regularly throughout the longleaf pine belt that once blanketed the entire southeastern coastal plain. That world no longer exists. In the 1800s, longleaf pine forest covered more than 90% of the southeastern United States. By 1990, less than 3% of that original forest remained, cleared for agriculture, timber, and the naval stores industry that harvested pine resin for turpentine and tar. As the forests vanished, so did the gopher tortoises that depend on sandy, open pine habitat, and so did the indigo snakes that depend almost entirely on those same gopher tortoise burrows for shelter during winter and during the extreme heat of Florida summers. But habitat loss was only part of the story. Indigo snakes were also targeted directly by the exotic pet trade for decades before legal protection, prized by collectors specifically because of their calm temperament and striking coloration, a temperament that made them tragically easy to simply pick up and carry away. Perhaps the cruelest cause of all was something the indigo snakes had absolutely nothing to do with. For much of the 20th century, rural communities across the South held rattlesnake roundups, festivals built around capturing eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, which also shelter inside gopher tortoise burrows. Hunters looking for rattlesnakes would pour gasoline directly down the burrow entrance to force the occupants out into the open. Rattlesnakes, it turns out, reliably flee this kind of chemical assault. Indigo snakes and the gopher tortoises themselves usually do not. Instead, they retreat deeper into the burrow and suffocate, killed as unintended collateral damage in someone else's hunt. It is difficult to overstate how devastating this practice was to indigo populations across the entire Southeast, wiping out entire local populations one poisoned burrow at a time, largely undocumented and almost entirely unnoticed by the public. By 1978, the damage was severe enough that the United States Fish and Wildlife Service listed the eastern indigo snake as a federally threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. Populations in the Florida Panhandle had all but vanished by the early 1980s. Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi lost the species almost entirely outside of a handful of isolated pockets. Gassing gopher tortoise burrows was not made illegal in Florida and Georgia until 2010, meaning one of the primary causes of the indigo snake's decline continued legally for more than 3 decades after the species had already been declared at risk of extinction. For years, conservationists watched the eastern indigo snake slide closer to true extinction with painfully few tools available to reverse the trend. Then, in the 2000s, a partnership began to take shape between the Orion Society, the Central Florida Zoo and Botanical Gardens, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the Nature Conservancy, and researchers at institutions including Auburn University. Their plan was ambitious and, frankly, slow. Breed eastern indigo snakes in careful captivity at a dedicated facility called the Orion Center for Indigo Conservation. Raise the hatchlings for roughly their first year of life to give them the best possible odds of survival, then release them into protected, restored longleaf pine habitat where gopher tortoise populations had already recovered enough to support them. It was, in essence, an attempt to rebuild an entire ecological relationship from scratch, one carefully raised snake at a time. The program's flagship reintroduction site became the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle, a rugged, biodiverse stretch of longleaf pine forest managed by the Nature Conservancy. Beginning roughly 9 years ago, biologists began releasing small cohorts of young indigo snakes into the preserve every year, monitoring survival rates, tracking movement patterns, and watching anxiously for any sign that the snakes were adapting to life in the wild rather than simply becoming an expensive meal for a hawk or a bobcat. Early results were cautiously encouraging, but far from certain. Reintroducing an apex predator into a landscape it had been absent from for generations is never guaranteed to work, and biologists candidly describe the early years of the project as walking a tightrope between hope and heartbreak. Then came genuinely exciting news. Field biologists began confirming wild-hatched indigo snakes at the reintroduction sites, meaning released snakes were not just surviving, they were finding each other, mating, and successfully reproducing entirely on their own in the wild. Researchers observed males and females sharing burrows, establishing overlapping home territories, and displaying the kind of natural behavior patterns that signal a genuinely self-sustaining population rather than a fragile, artificially maintained one. Survival rates among released snakes climbed higher with each passing year of the program, evidence that the restored habitat itself was healthy enough to support the population without constant human intervention. That steady, quiet progress led to the moment that eventually made headlines and, inevitably, punchlines. In a recent release, wildlife officials sent 42 eastern indigo snakes into the wild in a single push, the largest single-year release in the program's 9-year history. Each of those 42 snakes had spent roughly its first year of life at the Orion Center before being transferred to a hatchery along the St. Johns River to acclimate before its eventual release into the preserve. To someone scrolling through headlines without context, Florida releases dozens of large predatory snakes into the wild sounds like the opening scene of a disaster movie. To the biologists who had spent nearly a decade nursing this species back from the edge of oblivion, it was a milestone worth celebrating. So why does releasing eastern indigo snakes actually help control Florida's snake problem, rather than simply adding more snakes to an already snake-heavy state? The answer lies in what indigo snakes actually eat. Unlike most snake species, which tend to specialize in particular prey, the eastern indigo is remarkably indiscriminate and fearless in its diet. It will eat rodents, birds, frogs, small alligators, and, critically, other snakes, including venomous species like rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and copperheads. Indigo snakes appear to have some degree of natural resistance to the venom of the species they prey upon, allowing them to hunt and consume venomous snakes with a level of confidence that would be suicidal for almost any other predator in the region. Field biologists working on the reintroduction program have described watching indigo snakes actively hunt down and consume venomous prey nearly twice their own body diameter, behavior that firmly establishes them as one of the only true natural checks on venomous snake populations anywhere in the southeastern United States. That single ecological trait is precisely why conservationists view the eastern indigo snake's return as so significant, particularly in areas where human development is pushing venomous snake encounters closer and closer to backyards, farms, and hiking trails. In a healthy, balanced ecosystem, an apex predator like the eastern indigo naturally keeps smaller predator and prey populations in check, preventing any single species, venomous snake or otherwise, from growing unchecked. Remove that apex predator from the landscape entirely, as decades of habitat destruction and rattlesnake gassing effectively did, and the whole system loses one of its built-in regulators. Bringing the indigo back is less about introducing a new weapon against snakes, and more about repairing a piece of the ecosystem that was broken by human hands generations ago. It is worth being honest about what this program can and cannot do, because the truth is more nuanced than any clickbait headline can capture in a single sentence. Eastern indigo snakes are not being released into the Everglades python strongholds, and they are not expected to single-handedly solve Florida's Burmese python crisis. Adult Burmese pythons can grow well beyond 12 feet and hundreds of pounds, far too large for even the biggest indigo snake to challenge as prey. The indigo reintroduction program is centered hundreds of miles north in the longleaf pine habitats of the Panhandle, where the primary ecological concern is restoring biodiversity, controlling native venomous snake and rodent populations, and rebuilding a food web that lost one of its keystone predators. Meanwhile, the fight against invasive pythons in South Florida continues through an entirely separate set of tools: the hunting challenges, the paid removal contractors, and the radio-tagged scout snake programs that track reproductive females during breeding season. These are two different battles being fought on two different fronts of the same broader mission: protecting Florida's native wildlife from threats both foreign and homegrown. What makes the eastern indigo snake story genuinely remarkable is not just the ecology, it is the sheer improbability of the comeback itself. This is a species that federal officials once feared might disappear entirely from the wild within a generation, driven to the edge not by some dramatic, headline-grabbing catastrophe but by the slow accumulation of small, mostly invisible harms. A burrow-gassed hare, a snake pulled from the wild and sold as a pet there, a few thousand more acres of pine forest cleared for a housing development. There was no single dramatic villain in this story, which is often what makes ecological decline so difficult for the public to notice and to care about until a species is already circling the drain. And yet, through a slow, unglamorous, decade-long partnership between zoos, government agencies, conservation nonprofits, and dedicated field biologists willing to spend years tracking snakes through Florida heat and mosquito-infested pine scrub, that decline is being reversed one carefully bred hatchling at a time. There is also something worth appreciating in how differently the public reacted to this story compared to how the scientists behind it actually experienced it. To biologists like the researchers at the Orion Center for Indigo Conservation and their partners at the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, this was never a stunt or a gimmick.